Happy Tuesday. Thanks for joining me again to talk a little bit today about, boy, that is blurry to me, to talk a little bit about reading comp for both the SAT and the ACT. Before I sort of jump into it, again, feel free to shoot me questions at any time. If people have any follow-up questions from last week when we talked about tricks for the SAT and ACT of plugging in numbers, of using the answer choices, of the fact that the pictures are drawn to scale. Hopefully you got a chance to look at those sheets that we, practice problems that we posted on the website. Again, if you have specific questions about those, you can shoot us an email or tweet me at any time. Or if you have suggestions or things you'd like to address in the next coming webinar, I'd be happy to do that. But today we're going to talk about reading comprehension for the SAT and the ACT. And the big picture differences between the tests are what we talked about on the title for this, of the power of it versus the speed. And the basic idea here is that the SAT reading is harder, it has higher degree of power. It's more linguistically sophisticated, a little more tricky, a little more clever. Not all the questions, but some of them. But it's a little bit more gracious, a little bit more generous with time. The ACT reading, by comparison, tends to be more straightforward, less tricky, less devilish, less close reading, fewer questions where, gosh, it's like these are equally good, but they sort of beat you up on time a little bit. So we're going to talk through kind of what that means in terms of an approach for how we might do the reading on the SAT, how we might do reading on the ACT. When we started 3 weeks ago, we talked about that content-wise, the material that's on the SAT and on the ACT is very, very similar. So all that punctuation we did last week, 2 weeks ago, excuse me, same stuff on both tests, really, because a semicolon is a semicolon. The strategies that we worked on last week of plugging in numbers or using the answer choices work well on both of those tests, just like it would work on a graduate test for the future you guys who are going to try to go up to graduate school. The underlying math of algebra and exponents, really the same stuff on both tests. The big difference from my perspective is felt most in the reading comprehension on the SAT and ACT. Kind of different. I mean, yeah, it's still words, yeah, it's still trying to find the proof, but there's some really important differences. We're going to dig into those today. So I'm going to start with the SAT because I think in many ways it's the more sophisticated part, things where strategies matter more. You guys ideally have all taken the PSAT, so have a pretty good sense of how of what the reading comp on the PSAT felt like, because it's pretty much the same thing on the SAT. So let me point out kind of big picture the 3 reasons why I think people can get things wrong on reading comp on the SAT. The first might be simply that you don't understand it, meaning there are words in there that you don't know. You don't put the words together, you don't put the sentence together, and you might just fundamentally not understand something. If it's really geeky in science and that's not your jam, or there's one of those kind of old-fashioned Jane Austen kind of passages, and it just sails over your head a little bit because the language is really sophisticated, that will happen from time to time. And in many ways, it is what it is, because the words you don't know are the words that you don't know. What I'm interested in are really the second and third reasons why people miss questions, even though they know the words, they understand the sentences, they understand the passage, and still, darn it, I got that one wrong and I thought but. And so here are the 2 reasons. We're going to talk about these in some detail today. You can miss a question because you don't put your finger on just the proof that they put their fingers on, meaning the answer is proved by text. It's proved by evidence that's in the passage. It's the evidence-based reading and writing section on the SAT. And you may be looking over here and they're looking over there, and clearly that's going to make a difference. Or the third reason, second one that we're going to really dig in today, is that you put your finger on the same proof that they did, but then you got it down to 2 answers, and doggone, these things seem equally good, and you think it's B and they think it's D, and why? So let me dig into those things, because that's the most important stuff, and then we'll talk about strategy, and then we'll get into some nitty-gritty different types of questions, okay? So here's the big thing. We want to always read the passage first, okay? And you may have heard other people have different philosophies. Some folks say just read the beginning, just read the end, just read the first sentence of each paragraph. I just fundamentally disagree with all of that. And here's the deal, and this is being a little sarcastic, but you'll indulge me because you're teenagers. It's a passage of reading comprehension. So in order to comprehend the passage, I suggest that we read it. Okay? And this is really important for two reasons. But the first one is what I just talked about, that there may be getting us to look at information over here, and there's information over here that we need. So if you were to read just the first paragraph and the last paragraph, or the first sentence and the last sentence, or whatever, how would you know what you don't know, right? You know, how would you know if you're missing stuff? I really, really, really encourage every student that I work with to read the entire passage through, so you know what's in there, right? So then when they ask you a question, oftentimes you've seen this, they give you line numbers, right? And they might ask, what's the significance of lines 5 through 7? Well, almost never is the evidence only in those lines 5 through 7. Because they might ask something, what's the significance of the example that the author provides in lines 5 through 7? Well, that's where the example is. The significance of it, in kind of how she lays out, this is why I'm talking about this, is likely to be above, blah, 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 for example. Or an example will be given, and then a discussion will come later on about the importance of what those example was in lines 5 through 7. Now, again, you might be thinking, well, can't I just go read 5 through 7 and then go above and below? Sure, you could do that, but how many lines above do you go? 3, 5, 7? How do you know? From my perspective, I want to read the entire thing. So that when I go back to that question, I really understand the context for those lines. And I know that I can read up and above and below, kind of until they change the channel on me a little bit. But by knowing kind of the narrative of this passage, I know kind of when I can stop when I've got the information, or I can remember, oh yeah, there was something else about this in the very next paragraph, or even in the other column. So this is the whole thing, is that we know that the answers are always based on proof that's in the passage, and we want to make sure that we don't miss any of that evidence. So I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend that you read the entire thing. I'm going to I have a caveat on that. I'll come back to that in just a moment. The second reason that I want everyone to read the passage before they jump into the questions, or just not read the questions and look for the answer, but read the whole thing first so that you understand it, is this. That's fundamentally how you do reading in school, right? Now, I know there's some people who may just like, I read the Spark Notes and then I kind of, just sort of BS my way through class. But generally, if you're going to try to understand something in history or science or your English classes, you want to read the text. You may go back and reread parts of it with the help of Spark Notes or a teacher or friends or whatever. But fundamentally, we find the evidence from reading the text. And for you guys who are pretty academic, I want you to lean into that core academic skill that you already have. Why would you take do a test of reading comprehension and not read it the way you read everything else in real life? Okay? Added to that is this. From a stress perspective, our brains work better when we're a little less stressed than when we're more stressed. I think we can all agree to that, right? Again, raise your hands if you disagree with me. You can throw it in the Q&A. So if you're going to understand things better, if you're going to think more clearly when you feel less stressed, then reading the passage so that you can understand it will increase your sense of control. So I get what's going on here. Yeah, that part was really geeky. I don't love science, and there's some hard words there. I'll have to go back and read that again. I got it. But if you read the whole thing and have a fundamental understanding of the text, then you're going to feel much more in control, and you're not going to have that scattered feeling of, oh my gosh, what was going on? We've probably all had the experience where we read something, we get to the end of it, and you're like, oh, what did that just say? Kind of one ear out the other. And so along with this idea, we want to read everything. Don't skim. Don't rush. Don't read quickly. The time that people save by reading quickly is completely obliterated by the time that is lost in not understanding things. Does that make sense? So fundamentally, I want you to read the whole passage to really understand it. Now, the caveat that I mentioned a minute ago is this. Some people have an easy time reading an entire passage and kind of keeping the whole thing in mind. And some people find that harder. It's like my brain is full, I can't read anything more. If I read more, at the bottom I'm holding on to this, but I've lost what is at the top. And that's true for everyone to different degrees. It probably matters a lot. If you like the text, if you like this passage, then it's going to stick in your head more. If it's harder or you find it dull, it may slide out of your ear more. So on the SAT reading, it can be perfectly strategic to read the first paragraph and do the question that's on that, or the first column and do the few questions that are on that. Because one nice thing about the SAT is that the first question kind of goes here, the second question there, the third question there, okay? So fundamentally, again, we're going to read the passage first. We're going to read it to understand it. If you find yourself spacing out and find it hard, you can totally read a chunk and then do the questions on that, okay? Here's the second fundamental rule, technique, tool that I want you to use on the reading comprehension, and it is this. To the degree that you can, and I want you to practice this, because this is going to strike you as wackadoodle at first, I understand that, but I want you to practice this. And here's what you're going to do. You read the passage, you read the question, you understand the question, go back to the text if you need to. Again, when they give you line numbers, go above and below. Actually, if they give you line numbers that kind of start at the beginning of the paragraph, read into the paragraph above it. If they're line numbers that are at the end of the paragraph, go into the paragraph underneath it, because you can have extra information adjacent to it. But having read the passage, read the question, going back to the text to look for the proof, then, to the degree that it's possible, write down your own quick, short, 2-3 word, half a sentence answer to the question in your own words, or reusing words from that are already in the text before you look at the answer choices. Now, you might be thinking, this is nuts. Well, it's not, and I'm sure you're going to have concerns about this, so throw them at me. I want to have this be a conversation as much as we can. But here's the idea. If you take time, invest an extra 10, 15, 20 seconds, whatever, to write down your own answer, before you look at the answer choices themselves, you're going to do a much, much, much better job eliminating answer choices than if you just read each of those 4 choices and go, huh, is that true? Okay. So I was working with a student the other day for the LSAT for law school. It's like a super hard version of SAT reading. And I was giving her a hard time, and this might apply to some of you guys. And I said, your problem, Ariel, is you're just way too open-minded. You're like, well, that's a good point, and she makes, and that's a good point too. That is the worst personality to have for the SAT. In real life, fantastic, makes you a lovely human being, a great citizen, blah, blah, blah. On the SAT, that is not what we want. On the SAT, what we want is to say, well, technically this is wrong. We're going to come back to that in a moment. So the idea is this. If you can write your own answer first, this is what you're looking for. This is your shopping list. This is what you're going to find through those answer choices. Which thing aligns with what I already know to be true from what I just pulled out of the text? Got it? Then, when you go and look at the answer choices, you say, which of those things is close to what I chose? Now, I know that you've had the experience where you're going to be like, a bunch of them work, and you're absolutely right. By design, the SAT, because it's really testing how closely do people read things, by design, you're likely to have many questions where more than one answer works. Now, if none of them work, then what you wrote down there was probably not spot on. You might go back and look, or maybe then, okay, then look through the answer choices. But most of the time, what's going to happen is what you've written down there is pretty close, and you cross off, I don't know, these 2 answers, and these 2 both seem to work. Here's the fundamental thing. As I said before, you can either miss it because you didn't find the proof, ideally you have the proof now, or you missed because you're down to 2 answer choices. And the nitpicky kind of non-open-ended jerky way to do really well in the reading comp of the SAT is to say which of these things technically has a flaw. Technically has a flaw. Rather than which of these is even better, which of these has some little nitty-gritty detail thing that is wrong, okay? So let me give you 2 kind of wackadoodle examples. There was a passage maybe a decade ago on the SAT, described a writer who's African-American, and he was going to go back to Africa, wherever his family are from Africa from a long time ago, and sort of explore the culture there, explore the heritage, and look at the, the culture of that country to compare to what was in the US and how these things sort of informed his worldview and his thinking and all the beautiful writing that he did as a writer, something like that. Okay, so here's the question. The primary purpose of the passage is to blank, and you might write down your own answer on there. And then the answer choice that 1 million people chose was to describe the ongoing relationship between 2 nations. And all my students chose that, and they're like, no, I said, well, actually, that's wrong. I'm like, no, and they got all mad. I said, but. So, okay, well, tell me more, and they go on and on. And I said, well, I'm sorry, you're wrong. And they're super mad. And then I had to really, pour salt into them and I say, not only are you wrong, I actually know that you're wrong. I know that you know that you're wrong. And they're like, what? And I'm like, the reason I know that you're wrong, did I say that right? Is because you've already done second grade. And they're like, what? And I said, no, because you're a junior in high school. I'm pretty sure you passed second grade. And I'm pretty confident that sometime by second grade, maybe even before second grade, you learned that Africa is not a nation. And they're like, you have got to be kidding me. Because the question, and it'd be easier if you had this written down, was to describe the ongoing relationship between two nations. Well, it wasn't the ongoing relationship between two natures, it was between two cultures. And Africa is, of course, a continent, not a nation. And they're like, you gotta be kidding me. But this is the kind of trick that SAT, not all the time, but sometimes uses. And we wanna have that in the back of our head. So again, if A and D are equally good, you're trying to say which of these things is technically wrong, okay? Let me give you one more example. This is a passage, this goes like 20 years back. A young woman, Elizabeth Bishop, she describes how when she was in college, she decided that she was gonna become a writer. And so she was a huge fan of this one poet, I guess Marianne Moore, if I remember her name. Loved her poetry. It was all things poetry, reading everything she could of this woman. Went to the library looking for this book of poetry and couldn't find it on the shelves, and asked the librarian, said, I'm sorry, could you help me? Do you have this book of poetry? And the librarian says, oh no, I'm sorry, we don't actually have that here. But you know what? I know her. If you wanted to, I'd be willing to introduce you to her. And this Elizabeth Bishop writes, I was painfully shy, yet I immediately said yes, because it was a big deal and she got to go off and meet this writer and change her life, blah, blah, blah. Here's the question. The primary purpose of the passage is to blank, okay? The answer choice that my two students all chose that was wrong was to describe the significant events of the author's college years. And they're like, but look, this is the thing, and she met the woman, and it became her, she became a writer herself, it changed her whole life, blah, 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 blah. And I said, you're absolutely right. Well, why isn't that right? Well, because it's not. What? You're absolutely right that what you said is totally true. But the question said, the primary purpose of the passage was to describe the significant events of the author's college years, which it didn't do. The passage described the significant event of the author's college years. And they're like, you have got to be kidding me. And I'm like, welcome to the SAT. And if you can think about, this is the SAT reading is almost like it's written by people who are attorneys. If you know anyone who's an attorney, they're incredibly skilled, incredibly gifted with words, read things very, very closely, and they have to. Because if they're writing a contract or something, it has to be really, really precise. Along with people who are like the Department of Motor Vehicles, are like, well, I'm technically, and you're like, pal, that doesn't make sense. Why? I can see why you feel that way, but I'm sorry, a little bit of that. And so that mindset, we're still going to find the proof, we're still going to find the evidence that's in the passage itself. But after we've read everything and gone back and read with a bigger context, we want to nitpick and say which of these things is technically wrong, okay? So that's the big picture thing. We will read the passage, we will read in chunks if necessary. We will then read the question, go back and reread, and then, and I'll send these out in follow-up notes, you will write down your own answer first to the degree that you can, and then look at the answer choice. And if only one works, that's your answer and you're off sailing. And so to me, this idea of writing things down is a little bit like making a grocery list. It's a terrible idea, maybe you've done this, to wander into a grocery store, especially when you're hungry, and just kind of look at them, what's good? Because you'll make all sorts of impulsive buys that later you're like, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. And you'll forget half the things you were kind of supposed to get. We do much better when we go shopping, know exactly what we're looking for. Imagine if you had to buy, holiday presents for like 27 people, and you're wandering through the stores. I mean, you just go nuts, right? If someone can tell you exactly what they want, you walk into the store, say, hey, pal, get me this. I'll meet you at the register, and you're done. And you don't blow up your brain going, maybe this, maybe, too tiring. We go shopping with a shopping list so we get what we're looking for. We answer the question, having written our own answer first, and then look at the answer choice and see which one works best, okay? So now let me go through specific types of questions. Again, if you have questions, throw them up, and then we'll pivot over to talking about the ACT, which thankfully is much less sophisticated. Oh, one more thing about writing your own answers in. If you miss a question, which will be part of your process for practice, it's an incredibly useful diagnostic tool for you to figure out, how did I miss the question? Is what I wrote down, did I just miss it, right? Did I just write down the wrong thing? Did I not read enough, or there was something else, or just didn't get it right? That tells me I need to be looking at something else, and there's some pattern to what I overlooked in the passage. Or is what you wrote down pretty darn good, but still you got B rather than D, in which case we want to dig in and pay a little bit closer attention to the differences between B and D. And so go, okay, that's why B was technically flawed. It wasn't the event, it was the event. Got it, noted. Because the SAT, for all the reasons I like to give it a hard time, at least it is pretty consistent. So you might say it stinks, but I can say, hey, it stinks consistently. And so what you're trying to do is use your hard work preparing, and I know the SAT is not now until August, so I'm sorry. So you have lots of time to practice, but you want to use your time to learn the patterns of the SAT and also your patterns. And to the degree that your patterns do this, you're too open-minded, become more kind of and align with what the test makers are doing. So those questions that you get wrong are invaluable. Painful, I get, but invaluable for you to realize something about the test or about yourself as a test maker. And to the degree that they do that, you try to align them. So I may have made mention of this before, but I'll repeat it now if I haven't. If you do a section of test and you go through and correct and ideally understand every little angle of everything you got wrong, before you do another passage, take 3, 5, 15 minutes, whatever, to go over the corrections from the section you did last time, to go, oh, right. It's like watching game tape when we all played football. Before you then play the next game, before you do the next section. So again, you're aligning your approach with what you know to be true about the test, okay? So a few question types. One of the questions that we've already talked about are main idea questions. What's the primary purpose of the passage? The main idea is, the objective is the writer wrote this because. All of those are kind of big picture questions. And so of course we want to read everything first. Sometimes those questions, if you're not really sure, you may put those on hold, going through and do all the detailed questions, then come back and do that one at the end, because the act of rereading text to do all these detailed questions will help deepen your understanding of the main idea, okay? Here's the only big thing, kind of trick or caveat to think about with the main idea questions, and it's this. People frequently get those questions wrong because they choose an answer choice that is true, but not the main idea. What I mean by that is you can choose an answer choice that is technically a true statement, is something that's true from the passage, but it's too narrow. It's not the main idea. So to use kind of an unkind example, Romeo and Juliet, which I think most of you may have read or seen the movie of, I could accurately say that Romeo and Juliet is a story about a guy who kills himself. And that's technically true, but it's a little narrow, right? Because that's the last scene, as opposed to it's an epic play about two star-crossed lovers, you know, from warring families, blah, 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 which gives you much bigger context. So if you're trying to decide between A and C, that both seem true for main idea questions on the SAT, be sure the answer choice that you choose kind of fully encapsulates kind of the big picture. It's not a scene out of the play, it's all the acts that are in the play. That makes sense. Okay, a few more question types. There's the vocab and context question. You know, what does the author mean here? There's a question. I wrote this down from an SAT. The want of Miss Taylor would be felt for weeks. Okay, the want of Miss Taylor. Now, what you can even hear just from the tone of that, the want, so the lack of, or the missing of, or the desire for Miss Taylor, this woman he was in love with, which is like a weird use of the word want, right? And so it turns out when in the broader context, it was really the lack of or the missing of her, as opposed to the normal everyday definition of this is the thing that I desire, you know, I want or need. And so what the SAT does is really uses second or third definitions of words, or almost kind of redefines that vocabulary word in context. And so this again is why if you take that word, ignore the answer choices, go back to the sentence and try to write down, in my own words, what does that word mean as a word or a phrase, and then look at the answer choices. Almost never is the right answer the straightforward dictionary definition, everyday usage meaning of the word. That's almost never what happens. It's in context, the redefining it. And so a second thing, if you want to check your answer, is take whatever answer choice you think it is and go back to that sentence and read that answer choice into the complete sentence and see that it makes sense. Okay? A couple more question types. We certainly know that we have those double questions where they ask you questions and they ask you for proof. And you think, in theory, if you get one, you should always get the other. But surprisingly, it's pretty common for people to get one right and miss the other, including missing the first half and getting the second part right, which is always interesting to me. And oftentimes it can be useful to do those things together. Quick sidebar, I may mention before that the questions go in order, okay? So this is helpful. So if you're doing question 15, you're wondering where's the proof for that? Kind of look at where 14 was and look at where 16 is, particularly if the line numbers listed. And 15 may overlap with that, but it's likely to be bracketed. If 14 is here and 16 is there, 15 is not going to be way down there. It's going to overlap or be in the context of it. Does that make sense? So for those questions that this author intends this example to be whatever, and then the follow-up question is which of the following gives proof? Well, obviously you can use those line numbers to go and look for the proof to answer the first question, if that makes sense. And just make sure that those two things work together. Kind of take a little bit more care there to kind of double check yourself that this proof really works, that both of these things work right together. Hold on 10 seconds, looking over my list to see what else I'm forgetting. Oh, inference questions, that was it. Big deal with inference questions. There really are no inference questions on the SAT, meaning there are not really inference questions like you have in school. Inference questions on the SAT are really just main point questions, not main idea, not big picture, but main point, meaning a point that's being made in this part of the paragraph, these few lines, maybe this paragraph. And so again, we can treat that like almost like writing down the main idea question, but it's going to be a main point, just not said explicitly, not said word for word. So the author, let's think here. Ned is fantastically older than all the people who are listening to this, I presume. What can you infer from that? Ned's had more birthdays, right? Ned's had more birthday parties, maybe. So it's going to be something that is very, very close to what's been said there. Not deep, not reading between the lines. If you ever find yourself having profoundly deep thoughts, like maybe what they really mean is this, please stop. That's not what the SAT does. Save that for your literature classes where you're really thinking deep and reading between the lines. There is no reading between the lines on reading comp of standardized tests, full stop. Okay? It may be a second or third definition of a word like I talked about before. It can be, clever, they're directing you over here, but the text, the proof will always be in the lines. There may be words you don't know, but it will always be there. It's not going deep and sort of having some profound thought. Partly, it's the evidence-based reading and writing test, but also the people who make this test, one, need to be right because that's kind of who they are, but also they start with a passage. They take a line of text. They write a question for that line of text. They don't just kind of make up questions out of the ether, okay? What else? So inference questions, again, are just going to be main point questions, main idea questions, not the big, not reading between the lines. And then I guess probably the last thing, those chart and graph questions, make sure you read those things really, really carefully. Usually people get crossed up by that. They're not quite looking at the right part of the passage. Be clear on whether you're answering the question only from what's in the chart or graph or also including something in the text itself. But ultimately, these things are going to be about close reading. And you should be able to, for every single question that you do get wrong, and that'll be part of the process, be able to go back and find the proof in the text that you missed or some difference in the answer choice of why it was technically this one, not that one. Does that make sense? So again, if anyone has questions, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to pivot for a moment to the ACT, and then we can answer questions at the end. So the SAT, again, is about reading things really closely, having time to go back and reread them closely, really putting things together, kind of formulating our own answers, and then writing those down, and then comparing those to the answer choice themselves and looking very closely at the differences between or among answer choices. The ACT is much easier than that, by and large. Okay? Linguistically, it's probably a grade level or maybe 2 grade levels less sophisticated. Oh, I'll say this really quickly in terms of time management. I'll come back and talk about it for both things. Make a note to myself. So the ACT is just a lot more straightforward, a lot more straightforward. And here's the deal. For most of the questions on the SAT, many people, not everyone, but many people can read the passage, read the question, and just know what the answer choices are, because they're not typically as nuanced, as clever, as devilish, whatever language you want to use, as are many, not all, but many of the questions on the SAT, okay? So we're going to have the same strategy that we want to read the whole thing first so that we can take the whole thing in. The one big difference between the reading comp on the SAT and the ACT is this, that on the SAT, the questions, question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4. On the ACT, they've taken 10 questions within a passage and they've shaken them up and they've poured them out on the table. So question 1 could go to the end of the passage. Question 2 could go back to the beginning. Question 3 could be the main idea. Oh my goodness, it's all over the place. So the reason that I want you to read the whole thing first is this. Read it and read it well, like you are going to have a class discussion on it, not like you're going to get grilled on a pop quiz tomorrow and have to have memorized every single fact, but read it so that you understand it for 2 reasons. 1, there should be, out of 10 questions, 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 of these questions where you just know the answer. That will save you time. And 2, for the questions where you don't know what the answer is, ideally you know where the answer is. Okay? You don't know what the answer is, but you know where it is. Okay? Because the SAT, as I started at the beginning, is much tighter on time. Okay? On the SAT, you have about 13 minutes to do a passage. Okay? On the ACT, you have about 8.5 minutes to do a passage. And so it's just a lot more intense. For those of you who have not yet taken an ACT, the ACT is just a lot more fast-paced. So everything that we do is at a premium in terms of time. It is much easier to be precise on the ACT because it's more straightforward, but it is hard to be efficient in terms of time. So there's this tension between, can I go fast enough that I answer all the questions, but do I have the time to go slow enough that I get right what I do? For most people on the SAT, they can go slow enough to be precise and get right what they know how to do. On the ACT, more people run short on time. So I want you to read the passage first, wherever you can. Answer questions from memory. And you're going to want to do this for practice, because if you do this first on the day of the test, people get really anxious, okay? And then they want to double check every single answer. And the problem with that is you can spend time that's awfully valuable to double check questions that are already right and then run out of time at the end of the passage. And that's kind of a sad thing to do. So I can talk about this, but you really need to practice this to feel comfortable with it, okay? So with the ACT, read it, try to answer as many questions from memory as you can and see how you do, and do this for practice and try it again. For the ones where you don't know the answer, ideally have some sense of if it was first column, the second column is the top, at the bottom, and you can go back and find the answer in a way that's relatively efficient, okay? Do not write your own answer first on the reading comp on the ACT, not necessary, frankly, not that valuable, okay? The main idea thing still applies. Most of the questions in the SAT are very, very picky. They're really detailed questions, much less inference. Still some of that vocabulary and context, but generally it feels like it's a grade level. It feels like it's 9th grade reading rather than 11th grade reading, or 10th grade rather than 12th, is basically the deal. So let me talk a little bit about time management. The big challenge, the big thing that you want to think in time management on the SAT is that by design, there are 5 passages. By design, they're highly uneven. So there's always a science, right, really nerdy. There's always kind of a Jane Austen kind of thing, kind of old-fashioned language. There's always fiction, there's always nonfiction. There's also, and then there's a double passage, you know, the global conversation about, you know, Frederick Douglass and, you know, whatever, Stephen Douglas, you know, debates, all that kind of stuff. The double passage, we'll talk about that in just a second. But importantly, the passages in the SAT are by design very different. So some of them may really be your speed and some of them you may not like at all. And some of those passages are intended to be pretty straightforward and some of them are designed to be pretty darn hard. So what that means is that I want you to pay attention to which passages are easy for you, which ones are harder. And when you do this for practice, develop a habit of trying to identify what the hardest one is and try to do that one last, or at least do this figure out, maybe you want to do it first and get over and done with. My advice is do it last, because if you've done all the other 4 passages and they've gone well and you feel like you're on top of that, then you don't worry about if the last passage takes you forever because it's just hard and it's dense and you keep rereading things. If that passage is really hard and dense and it's taking you a long time to do it, and it's halfway through the test and you're stressing out, then you have that stress not only for that passage but for the 2 ones that come after, because you kind of feel under the gun. So in terms of time management on the SAT, my advice is to pay attention to, as you're doing all the practice tests, is there a passage that is consistently the one that is harder for you? And plan to do that one last, come back and do that later, okay? On the ACT, generally most people, well, half the time people struggle to get all 4 passages done. I'm going to talk about that. And sometimes people are pretty much there. If it turns out that you're going to do the ACT, but you simply cannot do the passages anywhere close to 8.5 minutes, if it really takes you more like 12 or 13 minutes to do a passage, then my strong advice is to do 3 out of 4 passages and just do really, really well on those. Get 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 of those right out of 10. And then the last passage, you just fill in answers. Because if you fill in answers, therefore, you should, 5 answer choices, you should get a couple of those right. 4 answer choices on the reading comp. You should get 2 or 3 of those questions right anyway. So plan to do 3 out of 4, and ideally have the one that you don't do be the one that you didn't like that much anyway. If you're, though, a person who can pretty much answer all 4 passages, but sometimes you get a little bit tight, I want you to practice for both the ACT, and you guys can do this on the SAT as well. What question, or 2 or 3, do I just not do? Do I just not do? So if you read a question and you go, oh my God, I have no idea. Don't invest 3 minutes of valuable time on some question that you know is lousy for you from the get-go. Go, toss it over your shoulder and kind of pat yourself on the back for being strategic, okay? Because if you could have, I don't want you to spend time on the 3 hardest questions and have them blow up the time that you could do another 5 or 6 questions and run short on time. I want you to do this strategically. And this is important. A lot of times people feel comfortable guessing at the very end when they're running short on time. And that, from my perspective, that misses half of the opportunity. And this is a really silly metaphor, but it might make sense to you. A lot of you may have had the experience occasionally being at, some dreary cocktail party where your parents dragged you there, or maybe at a party for people your age, and you get stuck in a conversation with a person instantly. You're like, oh my God, this is the last person in the world I want to be talking to. And you're like trying to figure out a way to get out of the conversation, but still you're stuck there for like 20 minutes or, heaven forbid, like 2 hours. Maybe you had that experience, okay? Good question on the ACT, I'll come back to that in a moment. You had that experience. In a perfect world, after you've suffered through that, you vow, I will never do that again. And you figure out some clever way to quickly extricate yourself. Like, oh, my pocket's dilated. I'm sorry, I've got to take this. You see someone coming, you pretend, hey, there's an eagle, and you go the other direction, whatever you do. And if you see trouble coming, you want to know, oh, let's get away from that. Ideally, you guys will have, by the time you actually take the SAT or ACT, you will have enough experience knowing fine question, oh, kind of a pain, but I can do it, versus, oh no, and you walk right around that. Just like on the math, right? If there's a question like, I have no idea, don't sit there for 5 minutes. That's a ridiculously poor use of your time. And the same thing exists on the reading comp. Most of these questions you guys are gonna be great with, and there's always gonna be a few stinker questions you're like, I got nothing. Awesome. Walk right past that one, crush everything else, and then if you have 3 minutes left, come back, invest 3 minutes on one question. I don't care, but don't do it at the start, do it at the end. So again, don't just guess when you get to the end of things. If the second question is one that's a terrible question, go right around that, remind yourself you're being strategic, you're not being defeated, and use that time to do questions that you know are better, okay? There's a quick question that popped up, said, what type of passages are on the ACT? The ACT is always is the most predictable. The first passage is always prose, so it's a fiction passage. The second one is always social studies. The third one is always social science. The third one is always humanities, and then the last one is always natural science. The ones that tend to feel the most different to people are the prose fiction, right, and the natural science at the end. Some people are more kind of English people and less science. Some people are kind of, STEM science and less English. So again, if you're a person who's a little bit tight on time, just pay attention to, is there a passage here that I generally find takes me more time, that I miss more questions on, or that I just don't like, okay? Now, a quick word on how I suggest students, double passages, let me talk about that, and then I'll talk about how you would actually do this for practice, and then I'll sum up everything we've talked about. On both the SAT and the ACT, there will be a double passage section, a double passage, 2 paragraphs, 2 authors. So what I suggest on that is that you read the first passage, do any questions on that passage. For the SAT especially, write down maybe a half a sentence of kind of the main point of that sentence, the main idea of that passage, excuse me. So you kind of memorialize the main idea of that first passage. Set it aside. Then go and read the second passage. Do any questions on that right now? Try and answer choices first, like we talked about. Pause. Write down the main idea of that passage to memorialize it, because then the questions at the very end will be comparison between passage A, passage B. And if you kind of memorialize the main point of each, it helps keep those things clear. And also by doing passage 1 and its questions, passage 2 and its question, helps keep them separate so you don't mix them up as much. ACT, similar idea, though you probably don't need to write down the main idea because it tends to just be a lot more detail there. But same thing, do passage A, any related questions, do passage B, any related questions. Now, a quick word about practice. I'm going to summarize this, then I'm going to take 5 minutes to talk about science on the ACT. I strongly suggest, at least when you're starting for reading comp on the SAT, reading comp on the ACT, to time each passage. Partly, you may not feel up to sitting down and doing 65 minutes straight of reading comprehension, or 35 minutes on the SAT, or 35 minutes on the ACT. More importantly, if time is going to be a thing for you, which it is for most people, oftentimes people will know, I just run out of time. But where do I run out of time? At the end, understandably. I wanted you to be able to figure out, am I running out more? Am I spending too much time on this passage or that passage? Was I mostly doing fine, but I got stuck on one question? The more you can sort of carve it down, if you're running a 5K, I want to know how fast you were on your first mile, how fast were on your second mile, how fast were on your third mile, in the last mile, how fast were you in the first, the first half of that last mile, the second half of that last mile, what was your kick looking like, right? And so we can really drill in. If with basketball, how many turnovers, how many rebounds, first, second, third, fourth quarter. So for the reading passages, do each of them, go through this whole process of how to answer them as we've talked about, but write down, actually count, grab your iPhone, what have you, and mark, it took me 11 minutes and 12 seconds for this passage. It took me 14 minutes and 20 seconds for that passage. And really pay attention to that, as well as the accuracy. And you can start to break this down and see what patterns you already have. For the SAT, it's trying to be on average 13 minutes, maybe a little bit less. It's going to take you a little bit of time to bubble things in. So ideally, maybe 12 minutes on the reading comp on the SAT. But you may discover that some of you do in 9 or 10 because it's just super easy for you. You love it. You understood it. You didn't have to go back as much. This one takes me 17 minutes, whatever. You're aiming for under 13 minutes. On the ACT, under 8.5 minutes. 8.5 minutes or less, okay? Because you have 35 minutes there, 4 passages, so if you divide it by 4, 8 minutes and 45 seconds, we need to leave a little bit of time for bubbling in the answers. A quick time-saving method, which applies to everything, but probably more so on the reading comp, because that's where people are most jammed up on time. And do this for practice. We don't want to do anything new the day of the test. When you're doing the reading comprehension, again, read the passage, blah, blah, blah. When you answer questions, circle your answer on the test. go to the next question. Answer that, circle the answer on the test, all the way through all the questions for that passage. Then pull out your answer sheet and bubble in the answers, 1A, 2B, 3, C, so on and so forth. For two reasons. One, mechanistically, you're going to save time. You're not having to pull out your answer sheet for every single answer choice and kind of, oh, you're pulling out once, bubbling in 10 questions, going back. So if you're making a car, you wouldn't make, a windshield, an engine, a bumper, and then put it together. You'd make 100 bumpers, 100 engines, whatever, and then put them together. So you're going to save time by doing less shuffling of paper. Okay. The second thing is, heaven forbid, if you were ever to miss bubble, you're in a much, much better place because they're all there. I did this one time on the SAT. I bubbled, and I take this with people your age, which is weird, I know. And I bubbled section 2 into section 3. This is the old SAT. And I was like, and it was the most stressful thing I've ever experienced on a test, trying to move away. This would be, it was terrible. Oh, sorry. It's a terrible, terrible thing to do. And it's even worse if you get off by one line number. That's just beyond hideous. If you had circled all the answers on the test, then you just move them one by one, and it's super easy peasy. Okay. And the third reason is this. One of the things that is really taxing on brains is going back and forth. And so you guys all know this because you're much younger than I. You multitask. Your generation loves to do kind of everything at once because it's exciting, it's highly stimulating, but it also over time wears you down. So it's easier on your brain, and the SAT, especially on the SAT, 65 minutes, that is a long slog of reading. And so it'll be easier on you to do a passage, circle the answers as they go, kind of keep your head in the game, and don't distract yourself going to answer, going back, that's a little crazy making. Read the passage, do the questions, circle them as you go, take a break for a minute, go and fill in those answers, then go back and do the second passage. When you start to run out of time, the last 5 minutes. You don't want to do that. Then start doing them one by one, because I don't want you to have a bunch of questions that you leave unanswered. Remember that there's no penalty for a wrong answer or anything. So if you have 2 minutes left, fill in everything so you don't leave them blank, because obviously you could get some of those answers right. Okay? Any questions about reading comprehension, throw them at me. Love to hear them. If you have other things you're doing, I'd love to hear your advice as well. And I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about the science section on the ACT. Now, for those of you who joined me on the very first meeting when we talked about the differences between the SAT and the ACT, I made the point, tried to convince you that the science section on the ACT is really not a test of science. This is not your biology class, your physics class, your chemistry class. Yes, you're going to have passages in all of those things, as well as, volcanology, meteorology, and all kinds of other ologies. But fundamentally, the science passages on the ACT are really reading comprehension of charts and graphs, okay? So what I like to have people do generally is to read a little bit of the introduction of the science, not as deeply as we do on the reading comp on the SAT or the ACT, but mostly to kind of get a big picture context, to have some clue of what they're talking about. There's another reason I'll come back to in a moment. So they have some context for these questions, because again, if you feel like if you have a sense of control, if you have a grounding in this, it helps a lot. Just like if you get a science passage where you've already done that lab in school, these questions are different, but you're like, yes, because you already have a clue. You've looked at this, you know what you're looking at, you've done a Punnett square, you understand, pH. You feel so much better because it's not a new thing. It's not the novel coronavirus. It's the old coronavirus. You feel so much better with that. So if you can read a little bit at the beginning, again, don't get in the weeds. I always joke, it's like reading, if you read the ingredient labels on a granola bar or friggin' anything, the first 4 or 5 ingredients make sense to you. And the last 5, it's like you're just making up words. I have no idea what those things are, right? So, or the beginning of it makes sense, and the end of it can kind of feel like the bottom of a car commercial. So read the stuff that kind of gives you an understanding of the experiment itself, of the design of the experiment, and then go and do the questions. The key things with the science, underline keywords, be incredibly attentive to. Is it figure 1 or figure 2? If you're looking at figure 2, you're going to get the wrong answer. If you're looking at figure 1 when it should be table 1, you're going to be super confused. Read those things slowly and make sure you navigate yourself to the right place. The fascinating thing for me about the science is you can, for most of the questions, you can have no conceptual understanding of the underlying science, and still you can get most of the questions right. Because really the questions, it's about reading charts and graphs. And by saying, okay, in figure 1 at 2.5 of this, when it's 20 degrees Celsius, whatever, and you go rant, 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 and find that. What are they talking about? It may not actually matter. If you read it carefully, you get yourself to the right number. And that's going to get you typically the first 2/3 of the questions right on every single passage, okay? Now, the questions at the end are more often thoughtful, more difficult for 2 reasons. One, they go back to the design of the experiment and ask for you to have a more conceptual understanding of what's being done and why. And so that's why I like to have people read a little bit at the beginning so your brain can kind of be processing that when you then come back to this question. And you're going to need to go back oftentimes and reread the design, reread the setup to go, oh, right, that's why they were doing this. Any question about why is almost always going back to the start of the passage where they explain, okay? Why did they cool the water bath? You know, why did they wait 20 minutes? Why did they? Is always about, well, what was the experiment? Oh, they heated things, so that's why they're waiting for it to cool, okay? Or that last question can be something about a conceptual understanding of science. Now, these are the few questions that can have some real science, but they're not going to be super nerdy. They might ask you, they might expect you to understand how global climate change, how global warming works, and you know what greenhouse gases are. They might ask you to understand, you know, how chlorophyll is made. They may ask you to understand what a balanced chemical equation looks like. Typically, you know, 1 question, 2 questions, 3 questions like that per entire section, not a ton of them, okay? They require outside knowledge. More often, those questions at the end will lean on your scientific reasoning, your logical reasoning. So they'll talk about if when the temperature was raised in the whatever experiment, pressure increased. So what's likely to happen if temperature is decreased? And you're like, if temperature, so pressure goes up, when temperature goes up, pressure goes up. So if you decrease the temperature, I'm pretty sure the pressure will go down, right? Or they can ask you about, oh gosh, what was the plan? About erosion, right? And so if you have animals that are eating all of the vegetation, you'll have higher erosion. So these are things that are kind of logical reasoning. Here's what I want you to know. For the 40 questions that are on the science, typically there's 1, maybe 2 questions that actually are kind of nerdy science. There are generally 4 questions that lean into your just logical reasoning. No answer, no correct answer on the science section will ever be inconsistent with real science, with anything you've ever learned in science or on the Discovery Show, or with logical reasoning. So I want you to trust your own logic, your own learning, your own common sense. In part because, again, there are probably 3, 4, 5 questions that really lean on nothing more than your logical reasoning and your own common sense. And so if you're looking around for the answer somewhere in the passage, and they basically just kind of giving you a little thought experiment, and you have to go, oh, okay, when I lower the temperature, the pressure goes down. And that's all that they're asking you to do. So I don't want you to think you're constantly always looking for an answer in the chart or graph. Sometimes you're just having to stop and think and say, what are they really asking me here? Okay? So let me review all that stuff really quickly. SAT, read the passages first. Be smart about which passages you do last. Write your own answer choice first before you look at the answer choices to the degree that you can. Then compare to the answer choices. And if more than one works, ask yourself which of these things technically has a flaw. On the ACT reading, read the whole thing first to the degree that you can because the questions are not in order. Try to answer as many questions as you can from memory, and then maybe 1 and maybe 5. And then for the other ones, you go back and find the answers and just get really nitty-gritty nerdy on it. If there's a question where like I have no idea and you're blowing up the time, don't invest 3 minutes on that one question. Invest the 3 minutes on 3 other questions that must be easier than that one. And then the science, treat it like it's reading comprehension of charts and graphs. Read the intro so you kind of get the fundamental understanding of it, and then be really detailed in reading those questions. On the science, it should be about 5.5 minutes per passage. Again, circle the answers as you go. If you find that really it takes you 7 or 8 minutes to do the passages, what I suggest on the science is just by design, plan to skip 1 or 2 of the last questions on there, because those are going to be the hardest, the most time intensive. Do the 3, 4 easy ones, skip the last question, do the 3, 4, 5 easy ones, next passage, skip the last one, and do that all the way through. Hopefully that was somewhat useful. We have passages online already. A test that we wrote for the ACT, a test we wrote for the SAT, reading comp in there. You can do the math and writing as well if you like. The answers are all at the end. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Again, if you have, as always, if you have questions, feel free to shoot us an email, shoot me a tweet. I hope you have another great week in paradise, Corona 2020. Hope to see you guys next week. Thanks.